Great. Well, thank you to the organizing committee for giving me this opportunity to speak to you all. It's a great conference so far. It's the first time I've been at this conference, even though I have been part of the transitions community for about 15 years. In the United States, we have a lot less funding for transitions research, so that's one of the reasons why there are fewer US participants, but it's great to be here. And I guess a reflection from the previous talk. In the United States right now, we have some policymakers advocating for the Green New Deal, which is a big acceleration attempt to transition. And it's integrating sustainability, climate change, energy with jobs and social justice. So there are examples of real radical attempts for radical change in the policy world. You may have noticed that feminism is in the title of my talk. And I know you may be intrigued by that. Some of you have already told me you're very excited about that, to see that in the title. Some of you may be uncomfortable with that. You may be asking, what does feminism have to do with transitions, sustainability transitions, and how do issues of race, gender, economic inequities, and oppression connect with accelerating transitions? So what I'm going to try to do in my time is convince you that integrating a feminist, anti-racist, anti-oppression lens is critical. And until and unless we are able to prioritize dismantling systems of oppression, change will continue to be slow and ineffective. So I think I can make the case that the inadequacy of our responses to climate change and the challenges of sustainability are really a result of the oppressive power dynamics, the patriarchal structures that give disproportionate power and influence to a few, mostly rich, older white men, and who then need to sustain their positions of power, need to perpetuate those systems of oppression. So we need to get out of those cycles, and that's what I'm going to try to talk about today. So to accelerate transformation, I'm going to focus on three points. One, we need to redistribute power, literally and figuratively. My own work focuses on energy transformation, moving away from fossil fuel-based systems toward renewables, and how we can harness that transformation that is happening for social justice. Second, I'm going to talk about resisting fossil fuel-based power structures. The fossil fuel-based power structures are influencing our culture, our social norms, all kinds of things that we need to pay more attention to resisting. And third, I'm going to talk about diversifying to avoid perpetuating systems of oppression. Yesterday, Joachim talked about diversification, but he was talking about diversification of technology. I'm talking about diversification of people, voices, and ideas, and narratives, and strategies. So you may ask, why a feminist lens? And I'm from the United States, where we are experiencing extreme oppression, basically. So feminism is, I like Bell Hook's definition, which is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. Explicitly, the idea of oppression is not just about gender dynamics. It's about all forms of power imbalances and oppression. So feminists are those who acknowledge problems with gender equity and want to make changes to improve. And what feminist curiosity, bringing a feminist lens to anything that we're exploring, what that does, it really reveals these patriarchal systems that are usually kind of blended into the background that we don't pay attention to. And those systems are made up of values, beliefs, and relationships that perpetuate domination, intimidation, and submission. And so we need to be able to acknowledge that and bring that forward and that's where a feminist lens really offers us value. I will just take the opportunity to do a little audience participation here. How many of you consider yourselves feminists? All right, quite a strong representation, and that's great to hear. Here we are. I also want to talk a little bit more about this idea of oppression and why it sounds like a strong word, oppression, but it's really all about power dynamics and some having control over others. This is from the World Inequality Report. This is the top is the United States, with the top 1% is in the red, and this is just since 1980. You can see that the percent, and on the y-axis is the share of national income, and you can see the concentration of wealth and power in the United States in particular, compared to Western Europe, not as bad. And this, I know there are many people who are not from either Western Europe or the United States in the room. And on the right here is a global perspective with different regions of the country. Basically, the concentration of wealth and power is increasing throughout the world, but the United States is a particularly challenging situation. And there's growing socioeconomic inequities. And in the United States, there's also racial inequities that are really related to our historical positionality with slavery. There's growing mistrust among individuals and institutions. And this idea of just transitions, which hasn't yet, has been maybe discussed a little bit yesterday in some of the sessions, is really this idea of connecting justice with transformation and transitions. So I did just want to mention that oppression is about violence. It's actually about controlling other people in ways that they don't want to be controlled, which means force, which means violence. And this is uncomfortable. Most people don't want to talk about it. Me even asking who's in the room is a feminist may have made some of you feel uncomfortable. And these issues are uncomfortable. And too often we stay in our comfort zones, and that's part of the reason why we can't accelerate the transition, because we are we need to get more comfortable. Transitions are disruptive, which means we have to disrupt our normal ways of thinking about things. So with that, I'll just go through these three points, and I want to start with the idea of redistributing power. And as Helene mentioned yesterday, it really matters how we transition, how we respond to climate change. It's not just 100% renewables. No matter how we get there, it doesn't matter. We just need to get the renewables. It really matters who's involved, who's being included, who's being excluded, who benefits, and who is disadvantaged during the transition. So this idea of energy democracy, which is a growing social movement that really is focused on redistributing power through the renewable energy transformation, really prioritizes diversifying energy decision-making, being more inclusive, participatory, and collaborative, and distributing ownership and benefits. And the energy democracy movement has a vision of a 100% renewable future that is a locally appropriate mix of renewables. It has evolved really in response to and resisting the corporate control of fossil fuel industry. It's also evolved in response to a technological optimism and a focus on technological fixes and technology, and trying to bring elevate the social potential and social innovations more explicitly. And it's also a resistance to kind of our patriarchal systems that advance this technocratic kind of perspectives. So the power of energy democracy, particularly in the United States, is that it doesn't necessarily have to connect to climate change, which has become very bipartisan and controversial. But it aligns social movements, including all kinds of social justice movements, Black Lives Matter movement, human rights movements, and really as a coalition of different progressive agendas advocating for change. It really offers an alternate vision to fossil fuel dominated systems, acknowledging how the fossil fuel industry has not only, it itself characterizes income inequality and the failure to distribute wealth, but also how the fossil fuel industry has had a decades-long intentional misinformation campaign on climate science, and that has infiltrated our culture that has led to some of the resistance to the change. So there's a lot of possibilities for democratizing and decentralizing energy, thinking about how the power is centralized, not just the grid, but also who controls and manages and influence our energy systems. And the fossil fuel industry has very strong connections to our entrenched political actors and huge political influence, and that's obviously we're seeing that right now in the United States. So there's a growing social movement for more local community control of energy, and that's partly what the energy democracy vision is all about. So one of the ideas with energy democracy is redefining what our energy system is and how we're thinking about it with regard to political power. And so thinking instead of energy consumers, not as energy consumers, but energy citizens. Think about energy as a public good, the infrastructure as public works, common resources, and really thinking about moving away from this corporate control toward more public and community control. So Matt Burke is here. He is a PhD student, or no, he was one of my PhD students and is now graduated. And we've written about energy democracy, and it's really, some of the framing is resisting the dominant energy agenda, reclaiming the energy sector so that there is more public and community control, and then restructuring it for more community and local ownership and more common governance. And one of the things that we found we looked through all policies in the United States that you could characterize as potentially within the framework of energy democracy, and there was a lot more policy on the reclaim and restructure of the energy system and a lot less on resisting the fossil fuel infrastructure. So that brings me to my second point, where I wanted to emphasize the importance of resisting fossil fuel-based power structures. And this, again, is uncomfortable. A lot of us are pressured not to talk about this because fossil fuel influences are so powerful. But it's important that we put it on the table, particularly in the United States, where we have our national energy policy right now is actually being guided by energy dominance, which is a very blatant framing that acknowledges explicitly the dominance and the power and the control and the oppression associated with the fossil fuel-based infrastructure. It's really a focus on accelerating fossil fuel extraction and export, kind of ignoring the potential of renewables. And it is, as you can tell from this picture, very nationalistic, masculinist, and very few, there are only 31% of the United States are white men, but they are very well represented in this photograph. So energy democracy and energy dominance are really kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. Energy democracy is future-oriented, thinking about community control and the public good. Energy dominance is actually, as I said, almost the opposite end of the spectrum, focused on reclaiming some mythical past, centralizing control, good for only a very few people who will profit a lot, who are already profiting a lot. And so it's real disconnect there. I did want to mention one other kind of concept related to injustices associated with the fossil fuel infrastructure and power structure. And this has to do with a notion of embodied energy injustices, which is all the hidden, distant, and transboundary injustices associated with the supply chain of fossil fuels, all the way from extraction, processing, transport, which often in our communities, when we're talking about energy policy locally, we don't even consider those. And so there's all kinds of oppression and injustices happening in our supply chain of energy that often don't get discussed. The other kind of obvious, and I know some of the talks I went to yesterday highlighted this fact, that resisting fossil fuels obviously offers so many benefits beyond climate change, health, and other benefits that, there's many reasons why transitioning away from fossil fuels toward renewables offers benefits to society. So the third point that I want to emphasize here is the idea of diversifying to avoid perpetuating our systems of oppression. And as I said at the beginning, I think part of our inadequacy in responding to climate change results from a limited number, the limited people who are being involved. It's been kind of technocratic, male-dominated approaches. There's some real arrogance among the climate energy experts. I was trained as a scientist and engineer, and I know many climate energy experts who really truly believe that if the rest of the world just understood as much as they understand, all the problems would be solved, right? So they think they have the answer, and we're just all too dumb or whatever and so that is a deep arrogance that sets also, like, people don't necessarily get that, but you kind of get it over time, and it creates this division and elitism, and people are like, well, why do I need to care about that? And it doesn't connect with humanity in a very good way. So we are at a time where we have some new visionary young leaders. Many of them are not men. There's a lot of space for men as well. This is not trying to limit anybody's possibilities for engaging here. But we have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is the youngest member of Congress in the United States. She is only, I think, 31. She was a bartender before she got elected to office. She's amazing in terms of her ability to call out all kinds of injustices, and she has proposed, and she has gotten a lot of support for a real transformative agenda on climate and energy and social justice. Then obviously we have Greta, who many of other people have mentioned, and the whole youth movement. We also have this is my Congresswoman, Ayanna Pressley, from Massachusetts, who was just recently elected into office. And she brings a whole different perspective in terms of a young Black woman who calls out the oppressions every single time she speaks. And it is very powerful, and it's really, really important, and it's changing the discourse. So I just wanted to kind of elaborate a little bit on this point about diversity. And I've done some work on thinking about diversity in the energy space, and I've been to many conferences like this, with this panel of all white men. And there are multiple benefits to considering the diversity in energy, and really quickly, promoting more sustainable energy practices, inclusive engagement, actually accelerating and improving innovation, because we know diversity actually helps with innovation, and obviously enhancing economic opportunities. So I won't go through all of this, but you can read the paper if you're interested. But basically, promoting more sustainable practices, the sociology research emphasizes that there are gender differences in engagement on environmental issues. Having more diversity in the energy sector will empower different people in society to be involved and know about energy. Diversity can actually accelerate and improve innovation. We have the example of the very cold air conditioning in the United States. A lot of the buildings are the temperature in the summer is put up very, very cold. People are freezing in the office. And it was an algorithm from the 60s, when most of the offices were just men wearing full suits, and so nobody thought to look at the algorithm and change it, and women actually often, on average, get colder more easily, so it is a gendered thing there, and it's wasting energy, and it's a loss for productivity. There's also a recent new book on the data bias in a world designed for men, how everything from our healthcare system and drugs to car safety and the dummies in the car things are all, they just assume the default person is a middle average white man, and there's all kinds of implications of that when we just assume that most things are designed for white men. So there are hidden injustices, I guess, associated with all kinds of things. I will also just mention the risk perception literature. This is, they're asked people all about all kinds of different risks, from cigarette smoking to at the top to commercial air travel at the bottom. And consistently, the white males think everything is less risky. And people who are not white think things are more risky, and people who are female think things are more risky. So that says something about our sense of vulnerability and precariousness in society. So again, that also, you know, if we have all of our systems and decisions being made by white men, they're going to think everything's less risky, so we might end up in a more risky situation. So I just wanted to also mention that diversity will really amplify attention to social innovations. We, you know, even in this, I mean, in this community where it's very much focused on the socio-technical systems, and so it's trying to connect the technical with the social, yet the technological innovation, you know, still gets emphasized, I think, a lot. And there's so much social innovation that we are not researching as much as we should. There isn't as much funding for it. There's a lot that more to be studied and to invest in social innovation, right? And that's the hard thing. Obviously, technical innovation is so tangible, it's easier for us to get our hands on, but there's a lot of social innovations across the board that we should also be looking at. This is actually a schematic for the course that I teach. So this is my course map, and we go through different sections of this throughout the semester. So I will end there, but I just want to say we really can harness the urgency of the climate, you know, what we heard yesterday about the IPCC report, and obviously the climate emergency. So there's possibilities to harness the climate emergency to advance social justice, and vice versa. We can harness our outrage about social injustices to accelerate our transition towards sustainability. You know, we have to ask, is there urgency for dismantling systems of oppression? Are people outraged enough about the systems of oppression that we have? And I would argue that we're at a moment, particularly in the United States, where our president has now 22 women who have accused him of sexual assault. We have children, immigrants, literally in cages, in inhumane conditions. So there is outrage, and it's uncomfortable. And I think what we can try to do is let go of defensiveness, and but it is going to feel uncomfortable to challenge these power structures. The racial injustices are also really, really troubling with our police system, and the disregard for life in Black lives. So I think that I'll end there. Hopefully these 3 points kind of came through. And I'll just also mention Mary Robinson's famous quote, "Climate change is a man-made problem that requires a feminist solution." Thank you.